It is not by wearing down into uniformity all that is individual in themselves, but by cultivating it and calling it forth within the limits imposed by the rights and interests of others, that human beings become a noble and beautiful object of contemplation. And as the works partake the character of those who do them, by the same process human life also becomes rich, diversified, and animating, furnishing more abundant aliment to high thoughts and elevating feelings, and strengthening the tie which binds every individual to the race, by making the race infinitely better worth belonging to. And here's the key sentence: in proportion to the development of his individuality, each person becomes more valuable to himself, and is therefore capable of becoming more valuable to others. There is a great fullness of life about his own existence, and when there is more life in the units, there is more in the mass which is composed of them. Anyone want to put in his or her own words what this passage is saying? Why is he encouraging individuality? Why is he encouraging liberty of conduct? What is the essence of what he's trying to say here? Anyone want to put it in his or her own words? Yes, Barbara?
Well, the parts are all important and have a critical and unique role, but the sum is greater than the whole of the parts.
I'm not sure here he's saying the sum is greater. It's probably true. But here I think he's saying two things. Number one, as you develop your own individuality, he says you become more valuable to yourself. You suddenly discover that you are not dispensable as a human being. You have something of your own. It may not be Mozart. It may not be Bertrand Russell. It may not be Jascha Heifetz. But you have something to contribute. And it's a good feeling to yourself. You become more valuable to yourself. You realize, you know what? I'm not so easily replaceable. I have something to offer. It may not necessarily be the only person in the 7 billion persons who constitute humanity, but you do have something to offer, the loss of which will be a subtraction to humanity. And that's the second part of Mill's argument. The more valuable you become to yourself, the more you hone that skill, that talent, that ability, the more valuable you become to yourself, because you realize, hey, I actually have a real skill here. I have a real ability, a real talent. He says, the more valuable you become to the human race. And so then we all benefit from it. The more valuable you become to yourself, the more valuable, he says, you become to others. The more you develop that talent, that ability, that skill, that competence, which is not so easily replaceable, not so easily duplicated. You are no longer just a clone, another human being, but you are you. You actually become more valuable to yourself, and you become more valuable to others. And I think one of life's challenges, speaking here just a personal observation, is exactly what Mill describes here, trying to find out what is it that you offer, what is it that makes you different, what is it that makes you, in some metaphysical way, something that makes you indispensable to yourself and to humanity. I'll tell you, I don't think this is an idle boast. I'm just gonna, I was once asked by somebody, a friend of mine, he asked me about my abilities and my talents, and I said to him, you know, I don't suffer from delusions of grandeur because I've been around the smartest people in the world. I stumbled into it, and I ended up crossing paths with people who are, by any reckoning, the first rank. And I knew it was perfectly obvious, and actually they were so above me, it wasn't even painful to have to acknowledge it. We were in different ballparks, different leagues, different universes, you know. And it's easy for that to devastate you and shatter you. You suddenly feel very insignificant. It's like, why am I here? Everything I can do, this person can do, or that person can do. But over time, I did hone certain talents and abilities. I have a very good eye. It's not the biggest thing in the world. I have a very good eye for fraud. I could pick up a book and I could just spot nonsense in the blink of an eye. I do. I just have like this X-ray eye. I can spot it right away. And I have a good capacity for methodically exposing it because I kind of like it. It's like a puzzle to me. How did this person construct this fraud? It's just it's like a little mystery. I've always liked murder mysteries, crime mysteries. How did that person do it? How did the person take the real evidence and turn it into negative A? And so it becomes a kind of challenge to me to take it apart and reconstruct how this fraud was constituted. So,
We're wondering who you're referring to right now.
No, there are many cases, you know, I've done it many times. And I remember when I had written up when I responded to this person, he passed it on to a mutual friend of ours. Most of you know Noam Chomsky. And Chomsky said, yeah, he accurately describes himself. I said, what I do well is pretty small, but I do it well. I know that. And so sometimes, let's say I find a book or something and it's fraudulent, and I have this feeling in me, if I don't do this, nobody else will. Nobody else will do it. Nobody has the patience. Nobody cares enough. It means sitting down and just taking a whole book apart. Most people don't want to do it. They're not. And so let's say if I'm jogging on the Coney Island boardwalk, and I'm thinking to myself, if something happens to me, this will never be exposed. And I have this like will to live just to expose it. And I feel valuable because I think to myself, nobody else will do it. I know it. Nobody else will take the time. Nobody else has the patience. You become valuable to yourself. You suddenly realize kind of, you are in your own tiny little way, you're indispensable because nobody else is going to do it. And I know I do perform a service. I have no visions of grandeur about the magnitude of the service. No, this is not Isaac Newton. I'm aware of it. Not painfully because, as I said, totally different leagues. No point in comparing. But you have a feeling like you have something to contribute. And you become valuable to yourself, and I think, what happened? Okay, thank you. And you become valuable to others. So, by way of introduction, I'd like to go around the room. We're going to start with the oldsters in the class who no doubt face that struggle of figuring out how do I justify my existence. So let's start with you. Yeah. Did you reach a point in life where you suddenly felt, I have something to contribute?
Yes, I have had that experience. Specifically, it was at a time in my life when my father died. I had just finished college. My father died, and my mother was left in a very deep depression over this. And I had plans for myself, graduate school, whatever, but I saw that I would be more helpful to my mother. I have to put aside my plans and stay with her and to help her come through this terrible period in our lives. And I felt that this was very important to do, and I had no remorse over putting aside. I was all of 21 years old, just out of college, going to go to graduate school. And I was disappointed that I couldn't do that. So I felt the more necessary thing for me to do was to put aside what I wanted. It made me feel very worthwhile because I was getting feedback from my mother how important this decision was that I did. And I felt this is an important thing. So it took a couple of years where we helped her get back on her feet, etc. But I felt that I was doing something valuable for her and for myself. I
don't want to in any way diminish what you said, because I know how tough a decision that is. In every family, when a parent is in that state, it falls on one sibling to handle those things. That's a iron law of nature. Don't ask me why, but that's what always happens, and it seems like it fell on you.
All of 21.
Can you think of an example where developing something in your own individuality made you feel more valuable?
Yes, as I, in my 20s, I had a lot of different experiences, and I saw lots of opportunities for myself, and I began to go for it. I began to go in those directions.
What years was
develop
that? I'm curious, what decade are you talking about?
We're talking about the 60s, the late 50s, 60s. No, it was in the 60s, actually, that this happened. And I made some very important moves for myself, and I felt very good about that.
Is there anyone else who can think of an example where they had a kind of epiphany that they actually were in some maybe tiny way, but nonetheless, you discover that you're somehow indispensable. Okay? Since we have, maybe what we'll do, if you don't mind, because we want the camera, I'm going to ask you to move down here. We're just going to arrange it so. And we're going to ask our visitor here, if you don't mind coming over here. And you, unless you have a camera phobia, to just come around over here. No, some people don't want to be on camera. Just move, and it'll just simplify matters. Okay, go ahead.
Sure. In high school, I suppose I realized that I had a skill of making people feel less guilty for things that they feel guilty about. And I never did this for things that I thought were wrong, but there are many times where people are consumed with self-doubt, and I kind of developed this real sense of joy in diminishing people's sense of guilt about doing things. And I grew up in a small insular Hasidic community. There were lots of rules and lots of reasons to feel like you were doing the wrong thing. And it's a skill I still use and value every day, and I think it's helped me form wonderful friendships. It contributes to the work I do.
Did it become a vocation or profession? Or still
It's in tandem, yeah. I mean, this absolutely contributes to the work I do. Yeah. Yep.
Ewart?
Yes, when I was in college, I took a speechcraft course.
And then when you were in college,
When I was in college, I did a speechcraft course. And the professor told us to do something out of the ordinary. Most of the students were doing something about AIDS, politics. And so she called a couple of us and she asked one of the guys to do something on submarines. I said, I don't know anything about submarines. She said, go and do it. And she came to me and she asked me, why don't you do something something strange, like what the Egyptians do, embalming? I said, I know nothing of embalming. She said, go and do it. And I decided to jump on it. And it was like moving a mountain. I don't know where to start. I went to the library. I went to the New York Institute of Medicine. It took me about 2 weeks. I went to the funeral parlor. I asked the manager to show me what's going on. He said, he cannot show me the actual dead person, but he showed me the inner workings. And when it was my turn to deliver the speech, everyone was paying attention because it was loaded with details, all the medicine and all the chemicals they used. And when I finished the speech, they were aghast. They knew nothing about embalming. They are asking me as if I'm an embalmer. And I felt a bit elated about that, and I could be the one to really enlighten them about something that they knew nothing about.
Well, Ewart, I don't want to know about it. I mean, embalming. Just want to go, and whatever happens afterwards, let it happen.
Huh?
I said, I just want to go, and whatever happens, happens.
What happened?
Yeah. By the way, I don't want to throw cold water on your parade, but I think cremation is the way in the future, which is going to render you redundant. Anyone else? Nobody here has had any experience of being valuable. Everyone here is just a clone, another dispensable human being.
I had an experience during the presidential election where I campaigned for Bernie Sanders, and it turned out I had this hidden talent for phone banking, where people I talked to across the country would thank me and tell me, like, what an amazing job. And I would convince people, not convince them, I would have a conversation with people and we would see eye to eye. And they would say they wanted to vote for Bernie.
Well, that must have been fun. Where were you? Which phone bank were you in?
I hosted them in my house, my apartment.
Oh, you were doing it in your apartment. I was in the one in Brooklyn. What was the main center? Begins with a G.
I went there too.
What is it?
Gowanus? In Gowanus?
Gowanus, yeah. Oh, it was a great experience.
It was a great experience.
Oh, yes,
We
it
tried.
was. Those were the days. Anyone else? Okay. You had your hand up.
I have a question.
Okay.
So
You need the mic.
it relates.
Mm-hmm.
It relates to the value which one gets from feeling that you're providing a service or having value. So I was wondering if Mills actually thought about for those who really have not succeeded. Maybe they've been a failure all their lives. They're not so lucky, like, some of us who have succeeded in some things or have actually something to contribute in their family, let's say. Whether he has considered how they could have contributed or they're part of the community as well, that, even if they haven't felt that they were valued or have contributed anything, that they are still part of that society.
Well, it's a good question because you're never quite sure whose mill whose audience who is Mill's audience? A lot of the standards he set, if he's in mid-19th century England, when people are putting in 12-hour days if they're living in the cities, and putting in 15 and 16-hour days if they're living in the countryside, the kinds of challenges he puts to humanity doesn't seem really within the reach of most people. They can't even think about being valuable to themselves and valuable to others, because 99.9% of their energies are expended just to stay alive, just to put food, clothing, and shelter at their reach and the reach of their family, which is, for those of you who were in our Utopia class, which was why More said, there can't be any real, this is Thomas More, there can't be any real human development unless you significantly reduce the working day. So long as the working day is what it currently is, and the working day in our society is getting much, much bigger. A working day is now 2.5, and 3 jobs. That was totally, I remember a couple of people who kept down a day job and a night job, but the idea of 2 and 3 jobs, that was foreign to my generation. These are kinds of luxuries that Mill is describing, which are really only available in his generation to a handful of people. But it can also be said, I don't know who Mill had in mind, but what he says has a general applicability as society enables more people to realize themselves, develop themselves. His argument has a general applicability, but I kind of think in his day it had a very limited applicability. It was only to a very narrow stratum of society. I mean, how in God's name could a mine worker connect with any of this? You go down the pit for 14 hours, you come home, you're just an animal. You're a ox, as Thomas More would say. Okay, somebody you had your hand up, yes.
Yeah,
You have to use the microphone because otherwise we won't trend in
Okay.
Saskatchewan.
I don't know if it's so important for a microphone.
No.
I was just thinking earlier that I felt like it was a good analogy for New York specifically too, to your point just now, that like what our culture is at, but then also New York is specifically very like high pressure with the working. For people who have come here from somewhere else, there's millions of people, like if you're in a creative field like I am, there's like 50 other people that are like very similar to you in talent, you know what I mean? So it's like in this particular part of our society, this is amplified. So I thought that, and then I also thought to what you had just said, that I mean, certainly 19th century England animal is, that, I mean, that it's unthinkable to, in comparison to where we are now. But I do think that even circumstantially, if you're in that position, there's still value. In the same sense that if you were someone who is incarcerated, or if there was any sort of extreme, there would still be value in making that peace with yourself, or finding what your own worth is. It's really an internal sort of freedom of mind and spirit, if that makes sense.
Look, what you're saying makes perfect sense to me. I still think one has to be practical about what you might call the economies of time. In order to develop any significant skill or talent, you do need time and you do need energy. And a lot of people, I mean, I think about my father. He worked 6 days a week, was up. He didn't, in my day, we didn't have alarm clocks. I mean, that may make young people laugh, but there weren't alarm clocks in my day. People had an internal clock. My father got up at 6 a.m. There was no issue of setting an alarm. I didn't even know what an alarm clock was until I was about in 5th or 6th grade. He just had the internal clock, got up, went to work, came home, and Saturday he worked half a day and Sunday he slept. I mean, you don't have much time. That's set up to think about individuality and developing your individuality. I think that's a reality. When I was in the 60s and 70s, we had a very prosperous economy. That's just a fact. And so I was able to work a half job. I worked at the Hudson Guild, the settlement house on 10th Avenue and 26th Street. I worked 4 hours a day. I lived a very minimalist lifestyle, that's true. But I was able to work 4 hours a day and do whatever I wanted with the rest of my time. And the rest of my time I had certain goals and convictions, and I was able to develop myself. I couldn't get by in 4 hours nowadays. I couldn't get by in 9 hours nowadays. I know that. It's not possible. And then you had all of these benefits. Just it was 4 hours a day. It was an after-school program from 2 to 6. But you still had all these benefits, holidays, sick days galore. I don't mean just, I had ended up, when I left the job, I had like 70 days accumulated, which I never even used. And you had free lunches. And that was 4 hours, but you can't, I thank my lucky stars. I grew up in that era. Nowadays, these are luxuries. I wanted to just say one other point. I don't want to make a too fine analysis of it, but you said at one point in your comment, you said, well, I have the same talent as 50 other people and you're competing with them. I actually don't really believe that. You know, I went to a very good graduate school. I went to Princeton. And I was very outclassed. I mean, these were really top of the line, creme de la creme. And I felt like I had nothing to contribute. I can't keep up with these people. But I did eventually find I had something that they didn't have. I'll admit, I have no problem saying it. It's not much, but it's still something, you know? So I don't think you're just like the other 50. I think exactly what Mills says. If you probe deeply enough inside you and you invest in developing that individuality in you, you're not like the 50 others. You got something. You got something. And if you can reconcile yourself to the fact that it's maybe not huge, but it's something, I find it's okay. That's why I can live with that.
I mean, I agree. What I meant was that it can feel like that in New York. Like,
yes, I can.
You know what I mean? Like,
of course, because New York is a magnet, you know, and then you're competing against a lot of other people who come with those same talents. But they're not exactly the same. That's the challenge, to find out what you got that they don't have. Now, I want to look at two other arguments, one of which is quite controversial, and that will be at the end. Mill says that we have to allow for liberty of conduct because all the great changes, advances, Cecilia, I'm appalled, shocked. And that's just the beginning. Mill says that all significant advances in human culture and in human civilization, he says they really only come about because of the work of one person or a couple or a few people. That's how he says we have to be honest about these things. The masses, he says, they're mediocre, they're average. And if we want to get beyond the average, he says, we have to make space for, in his words, the geniuses among us. To give them that space to show to the rest of us a new path forward, a new way to advance our civilization, to advance our culture. Not everyone can be a Martin Luther King. Not everyone can be a Mozart. Not everyone can be a Rembrandt. But he says, so far, when people read these passages, they say, that sounds awful elitist. Geniuses and the rest of us are mediocre. But then he says, I'll let him say it because it's actually quite beautiful. And I found it in its wholeness, quite touching, quite moving, and also, I think, quite convincing. So let's turn to, let's go to genius, Genius. Good. I'm also getting good at picking the good words. You have to admit that. Let's do persons of genius. Go ahead. And we're going to go down to, we're going to skip a few parts of it, but let's see. Yes. We're going to go down to strong man himself, but we're going to skip parts of it, don't worry. Just go, it's going to continue quite a long ways, Albert. So I don't know, we got even the Dutch Canal in there, and we're going to knock that out. The power of compelling others onto it.
Is it on here or do you have to go below?
Below. Let's see. Keep going. No, but we're not going to be reading all this. Okay, let's start at the top, and then we're going to, okay, who would like to read it? We had, you took a stab at it, or as I like to say, you took an OJ at it. Anyone else? There was a joke there, but it's already gone way past it. It used to be.
Do you want to tell me when to stop?
Yes, I'm going to tell you. I will cue you.
Okay.
Remember the key? What's the key? Watch the punctuation.
Okay. Persons of genius, it is true, are, and are always likely to be, a small minority. But in order to have them, it is necessary to preserve the soil in which they grow. Genius can only breathe freely in an atmosphere of freedom. Continue?
Yeah, you keep going. I will stop you.
Persons of genius are
ex vi termini,
more individual than other people.
Ex vi termini means just by virtue of the word itself. Mm-hmm.
Okay. More individual than any other people, less capable, consequently, of fitting themselves without hurtful compression into any of the small number of molds which society provides in order to save its members the trouble of forming their own character.
Okay, I'm going to just reread that part, and then we're going to skip a little. Persons of genius, it is true, are always likely to be a small minority, like one in this class. But in order... We'll let you just discern that for yourself. Genius can only breathe freely in an atmosphere of freedom. Persons of genius are, ex vi termini, more individual than other people, less capable, consequently, of fitting themselves without hurtful compression. When he says without hurtful compression, who's he referring to? Yeah, but who is suffering the hurtful compression? The genius is that, when you try to compress them into a mold, it's very hurtful. Look how it's damaged Albert. Correct, Albert?
Okay.
Less capable, consequently. He's testing me. I know you're testing me. You have to laugh at my jokes. You have to just go with the flow. I know Albert doesn't go with the flow because that's hurtful compression for him. Less capable, consequently, of fitting themselves without hurtful compression into any of the small number of molds which the society provides in order to save its members the trouble of forming their own character. Now, skip down to the general tendency of things. Keep going, we'll find it. General tendency of things. Keep going. We'll find it. I'm confident. I think you're going a little too fast for me. Okay, the average, are not only moderate, but also moderate in inclinations. Let's see, the general term.
Just look up a word.
Yeah, let's just look at general tendency. Okay. Yes. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Do you want me to start at the beginning of the paragraph?
I'm going to read, because this is only going to be one sentence. We have to skip. The general tendency of things throughout the world is to render mediocrity the ascendant power among mankind. Here he's referring to the spread of democracy. And with the spread of democracy, the masses then become the dominant force. And for him, the masses are mediocre. They are average. They lack genius. And now skip to, at present, individuals. Good. At present, individuals are lost in the crowd. Public opinion now rules the world. Again, he's talking about the growth of democracy and the fact that the masses now are the dominant power. Public opinion now rules the world. And now you can go ahead. The only power deserving the name is that. The only power deserving the name.
Oh, sorry, I don't understand.
In the middle of the highlight.
Oh,
It's
okay.
right here.
Okay. The only power deserving the name is that of masses and of governments, while they make themselves the organ of the tendencies and instincts of masses.
And then he's going to go on to say, that is to say, collective mediocrity. So, good. That is very good. That is to say, collective mediocrity. And now he'll go on to say, no government, and now you're going to read straight through. No government.
No government by a democracy or a numerous aristocracy, sorry, I can't say that, either in its political acts or in the opinions, qualities, and tone of mind which it fosters, ever did or could rise above mediocrity, except insofar as the sovereign.
No, only except insofar as the sovereign many.
Oh, that's capitalized. I couldn't see if there was a period. Except insofar as the sovereign many have let themselves be guided, which in their best times they always have done, by the counsels and influence of a more highly gifted and instructed one or few.
So he says, I know a lot of you are going to be put off by this, and you have the right to be put off by this. He says, so long as you have rule by the masses, you're going to have collective mediocrity. You're not going to have any distinction except in the single case where, he says, the masses allow themselves to be led, allow themselves to be inspired by one or a handful of individuals who occupy positions of power, which show the masses forward, who give the masses a guidance on the route to betterment. And now it's a quite beautiful passage which comes, one of my favorite in Mill. Go ahead.
The initiation of all wise or noble things comes and must come from individuals, generally at first from some one individual.
So far, it puts you off a little. It's sort of the great man or great person theory of history. The initiation of all wise or noble things comes and must come from individuals, generally at first from some one individual. So it has a very elitist cast to it, the argument so far. But then watch what Mill does with it. Go ahead.
The honor and glory of the average man is that he is capable of following that initiative, and that he can respond internally to the wise and noble things, and be led to them with his eyes open. I am not connecting this...
You're countenancing.
Sorry. I am illiterate. I am not...
No, you just can't see. You're at an angle.
Contentizing the sort of hero worship which applauds the strong man of genius for forcibly seizing on the government of the world and making it do his bidding in spite of itself. All he can claim is freedom to point out the way.
Mm-hmm.
The power of compelling others into it is not only inconsistent with the freedom and development of all the rest, but corrupting to the strong man himself.
Okay. Who wants to put in his or her own words what Mill just said there? I'm looking at just the last passage, beginning with the honor and the glory. You want to just reread that to yourself from the honor and the glory to strong man himself. He's making several arguments there. I find them, they're both beautifully put, but also in their own way, they are realistic, but also inspirational. They're realistic and also inspirational. Who would try in his or her own words to try to get all the arguments there, because it's a finely interconnected whole. Anyone want to try? Good. Go ahead, just get the microphone. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what he's saying is that there are geniuses out there who should be leading, and that the average man should be wise enough and smart enough to recognize that these people have something good to do and something good to say. And so they should, even though they cannot do it themselves, follow the right thing that these geniuses are proposing, or however that they could be part of it, they should follow.
Okay, I'm just going to change the verbs you're using a little. The initiation of all wise and noble things comes from some individuals, usually from some one individual. He says that's just the facts. There are a handful of composers, a handful of artists, a handful of political leaders who initiated the fundamental changes that enabled art, civilization, culture to advance. And in their own way, they are kind of indispensable. They change the course of human civilization, the course of human history. But he says, human beings, the average human beings, they have a capacity of their own. And the capacity is, even though we can't all be a Mozart, we can appreciate the music. Even though we can't all be a Rembrandt, we have the capacity to appreciate the art. Even though we can't all be a Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King, we have the capacity to grasp their greatness. And now in one of my favorite lines from Mill, he says at that point, he says, he can respond internally to wise and noble things. As I said with Mill, each choice of word is very conscious. He doesn't say they can respond intellectually. He says they can respond internally. It's this kind of resonance you get inside you when you are witness to greatness. When we watched the scene in our class here a few weeks ago of Martin Luther King giving that speech, his funeral oration the night before he was killed, I've seen it probably at this point 50 times. I still get shivers down my spine. There's just something about it. You feel like you're in the presence of greatness. It's not an intellectual kind of activity, Mills seems to be saying. Respond internally to wise and noble things. It's that the frisson, the chill down your spine. You're in the presence of something great, something extraordinary. And then he says, which is my one of my favorite little parts of Mill, they can be led to their greatness with their eyes wide open. What's he saying there? You don't have to trick the masses. You don't have to manipulate them. It's not like, as my 7th grade social studies teacher used to say, the masses are asses, or P.T. Barnum, another sucker is born every day. Mill is of the same school, I think, as Abraham Lincoln. You can fool some of the people all of the time, all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. He has a residual faith in people. They can be led with their eyes wide open. He's making the contrast here with being led like sheep. No, it's not sheep. That's not what Mill is saying here. The honor and the glory of the average man and woman, the honor and the glory of the average man and woman is that he is capable of following that initiative of the genius, the great person, and that he can respond internally to wise and noble things and be led to them with his eyes open. Not deception, not pyrotechnics, not all sorts of manipulation. The ordinary people can see greatness. I mean, we'll discuss that in a moment. It's a proposition, and we're going to have to debate it. And then Mill says he's very careful because he knows there could be a misconstrual of some of the things he said, that it may sound like hero worship or some great leader who forces people to see what's in their best interest. And he says, what does he say about that? Albert, what does he say about that?
He says, just what you said before, that you're doing what you're awesome.
But what does he say about the power of compelling? Go ahead, you know? What does he say? What is a leader allowed to do? What is a leader not allowed to do?
All he can claim is freedom to point out the way.
Mm-hmm. Only, he says a leader can't force you. You can only, by your example or by your persuasion, you can point others the way, but you can't force them. Because he's, at base, he believes in the democratic principle. You aren't entitled to force people on the basis of what's in their best interest or what's good for them. The most you're allowed to do is show them the way. Mill's confidence is, if you show them the way, they will respond. Now, that can evoke a certain amount of skepticism. So the most obvious example, which everybody in this room is painfully aware of, is our last presidential election. We're going to go around the room. I'll just throw it out there. I kind of think Bernie Sanders was an example of what Mill was talking about. He wasn't using any kind of fancy language. He wasn't trying to manipulate. He just tried to stick to the facts. It appeared, or could easily appear, to have been quite boring, his presentation. He had a little Brooklyn humor, but beyond that, it was pretty free of any kind of manipulation. And he was pretty repetitive in his message. But I think that had it been a fair election, which I don't believe it was, but had it been a fair election, I think Mill's faith in ordinary people, the power, the honor, and the glory of the average man is he's capable of following that initiative. They can respond internally to wise and noble things. I think there's grounds to be optimistic that this faith in ordinary people is vindicated. So there are two aspects to the Mill argument where I would want to hear your opinion. Aspect number one, is Mill right or wrong when he says the initiation of all wise and noble things usually comes from a few individuals, usually just one? Is that correct, or is that elitist? What do you say, Cecilia?
I'm thinking.
You're thinking. Okay, fair enough. Barbara, what do you say?
I would agree with that. I think that there's usually one person that has ideas, they have a clarity, they're very clear about explaining those ideas, they're very simple, and they have the power of persuasion. And I definitely think that those are outliers. I don't think that that's all of us.
Mm-hmm. So your experience in political life and public life, it tends to vindicate or jive with what Mill says.
So what I would say is, historically, if you look at our leaders, in amazing amount of the time, it's mediocrity that will rise to the top. I think occasionally you have an outlier who can speak the truth and communicate it to people, to communicate it in a way that it can rouse a following. But I think that those are outliers. I think in many cases, it's just mediocrity that has the benefit of whether it's money or a system behind them, or some other force that rises them, where they rise to the top. But I think in the case of Sanders, I happen to agree with you that I think the things that he was saying were true. They were easy to explain, and that he had the breadth of knowledge if he had needed to, but he spoke in very understandable sound bites to verify what he was saying, as opposed to his opponent, who was making wild claims.
What do you say? We're going to go around the room. Let's go to Albert. What do you say? Do you agree with Mill's two contentions? Contention number one, progress is generally made or initiated by geniuses. And as we said already, Mill is very careful in his choice of words, and genius is, it's a very limiting word. It's one or a handful of people. He's not even saying smart people. He's not even saying 1%. He's saying genius is, we're talking about a very few people. Do you agree with that, Albert?
I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that a lot of the people who do come to prominence is because our society is organized so that only a few people can come up to the top. First, because we live in a society where most people, they can't live up to their full potential because of constraining influence of like poverty, or maybe it's the education system that limits that's damaging effects on your creativity. I mean, we're just not even talking about like geniuses that died in sweatshops in other countries. And a lot of people who are brilliant, they only come to the top for other people to like follow or take example because they had the opportunities. A lot of it is luck. A lot of it has to do with money. You have like access to universities and opportunities and connections with other people, and their voices never come into prominence, or maybe because their message is so radical. Their message is so radical.
First objection from Albert is objection number one. He has trouble with this idea of referring to people as collective mediocrities. The masses are collectively mediocre, and he's essentially saying if they are mediocre, it's largely because they weren't given a chance. That there would be a lot more, so to speak, geniuses out there if people, most of society, were given a fair chance. But the large number of mediocrities and the fewness of geniuses has, in Albert's view, has a lot less to do with biology and heredity and have a lot more to do with economy and society. So, okay, I think that's a perfectly reasonable, plausible objection.
And the second thing I want to say is when you look at history, there's a bunch of like geniuses that pop up, and you don't really see the masses like contribute as much. Largely for the argument I just gave before, but also I think that once you're in a state of ignorance, like once like a certain field, there's like it's geniuses who are able to break through and come with new ideas. Like, for instance, like Newton was able to introduce a whole new framework of understanding the world through equations and calculus. And then physicists, they made all sorts of contributions here and there, but it stuck with the Newtonian framework. And then Einstein came along, and then he introduced relativity, and that completely, it didn't do away with the Newtonian framework, but it set up a new paradigm, and he basically invented a whole new field by himself. But now that the physics has become much more complicated, like I know people in physics, and they think that there will never be another Einstein. Not because there won't be more geniuses who give contributions more than others, but simply that physics is just so much more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And people can actively participate. And usually, like in physics, there's hardly most problems in physics, like it's by teams of thousands of scientists.
You have to tell me where you're going, and therefore, what do you conclude from that?
So I think that once geniuses come through a breakthrough from a state of like ignorance and unawareness, I think it's much more easier for it's much less so that there's going to be
another breakthrough
from geniuses instead of the masses collectively putting their participation. Once you reach a certain point in the development of a field.
I understand exactly what you mean. Once you reach a certain point in the development of a field, you require so much knowledge in order to make a breakthrough that any kind of breakthrough, it's only going to be a few people who have that knowledge.
Once you reach a certain breakthrough and a field develops, basically the masses can contribute much more. It's not going to be a state where you'll have a few geniuses leading the field.
Okay. What do you say, Cam? Which propositions of Mill do you agree with or disagree with all, or agree with all?
You know I disagree with pretty much everything in the world, but you know that I also agree with Mill because he's a supporter of individual rights, and I like that. I agree with him that the few, like the people who really have Those wise and noble traits are few, at least as it regards to being able to lead governments. That's a talent that people think everyone has. And unfortunately, that's how we get people in government like we have now. But I don't really know if well, let me make my argument and see if it relates to Mill in a way. I don't see in world history, whether it was in the mid-19th century or now, looking back, the wise and noble people very rarely rise to power. History's leaders are usually demagogues or they're hacks. In democracies, it's no better than in aristocracies or monarchies. So my question for Mill would be, how do you get those people into positions of power so we have Abraham Lincoln and not, I would have mentioned, look, admittedly, even let me put it this way, in the last election, how many candidates do we have? Like 30, if you count all the primary candidates
I
and
think
everybody?
on the Republican
25.
side, there were quite a few.
Yeah, they
The
had about
Democratic
17 at one
narrowed
point.
down pretty quickly.
All right, I mean, obviously, I'm not gonna vote for
Yeah.
a Democrat, so. I would say, admittedly, somebody like Ted Cruz, who's probably the best, and Rand Paul were probably the best out of all the people who ever ran last year. I wouldn't really use words like wise and noble to describe them. I just think they're good, solid people who have the right idea about government. But I think in order to be a real great leader, you've got to reach people the way Ronald Reagan or Abraham Lincoln did. And I don't see a lot of people in government like now who are capable of doing that.
Well, I want to just, obviously we disagree on Ronald Reagan. Maybe we also disagree on Hitler, I don't know. But the point you asked, and that's a crucial point for Mill, the point he asked is, how do you create a situation in which people who have wise and noble things to offer, that they have a better chance at occupying the seats of power? And Mill's answer is, that's the whole point of my essay, to allow people, to encourage people to be tolerant so that geniuses can emerge from them. And there is an assumption. The assumption is, if you open up space for the geniuses among us to cultivate their talents, to so to speak, show off their wares, he thinks people will respond to it. Now, you can say, on balance, I would say that happens 1 out of every 10 times. Or I would say, on balance, it happens 1 out of every 100 times. That for every great leader who the masses have responded to internally, there's a Hitler they responded to internally also. And why is Mill making the assumption, or appears to be making the assumption, that there is a greater likelihood that the masses will respond internally to a Martin Luther King than to an Adolf Hitler? Why does he make that assumption? You could say, reading the passage, he doesn't really make that assumption. He just says, as a factual matter, the honor and the glory of the average man is that he is capable. He does not say he will. He says he is capable. We have the capacity for appreciating greatness. He doesn't say how often we do actually appreciate greatness. He just says we have that capacity, and that if you believe in democracy, then anybody of real talent and ability has to show the way and somehow convince the people to follow him. You can't use coercive methods. That's a no-no as far as Mill is concerned.
One quick thing, just the conundrum. I'm very skeptical of democracy, but I certainly would not want to restrict voting rights to, particular people. I think the extension of voting rights in this country and has been a good thing. The problem is, if you look at our history as you've seen the franchise extended, we vote for increasingly worse candidates with the more people who get the vote. It's just a phenomenon we have to deal with. So I don't know if I agree with Mill that people are necessarily capable of responding to this kind of initiative.
You know, I can't get into a debate now about what the history shows. You could say the greatest president since Lincoln, the consensus seems to be, was FDR. He was elected 4 times. That I think what Mill says is correct. They have they're capable, but capable doesn't mean any certainty that they will. You know, it's a you know, the Lincoln thing. How much confidence? Lincoln was very careful about how he balanced. He knew some people, you can fool them all the time, and all people get fooled some of the time. Even those who think they're so smart get fooled. But he says, on balance, at some point, people will wake up. You can't fool all the people all the time. That was a very cleverly balanced statement by Lincoln. And Mill, I don't think, is very far from Lincoln. He speaks about a capacity. And the capacity is such that he seems to be saying democracy can work. He's not saying it will work. He's saying it can work. You can lead people forward. Remember, Mill was a member of Parliament. He was a public servant. He did try to convince with arguments. He believed you can, with their eyes wide open, they will make the right, they can, not will, they can make the right decision. And in the course of my lifetime, I've seen moments which vindicated that faith, and moments which threw that faith into doubt. I am a little different, a bit of an outlier, to use the expression, on the last election. I did not believe, and I do not believe, the folks who voted for Trump, I do not believe they were easily manipulated. I do not believe they were tricked. I do not believe they were deceived. I believe that they were given very few choices in the election. They were hurting badly, and they had a choice between more of the same and a roll of the dice. And there's a very good, rational, eyes wide open reason why they may have chosen Trump. Because Hillary kept saying, I'm going to build on Obama, it's going to be more of the same. But for 80% of Americans, more of the same was a nightmare. It was unemployment, underemployment, bills not getting paid, living with your parents, not being able to find a job. I don't think that last election proves that in any respect Mill was wrong. I think
She was very disdainful of the public.
that's another thing.
Calling them
The deplorables, you know.
That is not
And
the
she
way to
said,
win an election.
and she said Bernie's supporters live in their parents' basement in a contemptuous way. Yes, she hung out in Martha's Vineyard, but not all of us have that ability, you know. So yes, you said they were deplorables, fine, and now you're going to get it back in spades. Yes, I agree. Yeah. So I don't personally believe the last election necessarily disproves Mill's democratic faith, and I think it's just a the tiniest twist of history. Had things just been tweaked a tiny bit, we would have been talking now about President Sanders. It's very strange, but it was that close, in my opinion. It was very, very close. Just a tiny tweak, and it would have been a very different outcome. I'm not saying necessarily it would have been a better outcome, because Sanders would have been faced with a real challenge on his hands. But the Democratic mandate would have been very different, leaving aside the fact that Hillary got 3 million more votes than Trump, which, is a fact. I want to try to get some other people. Phil, do you have a comment?
A few.
Good.
So I'll start with the fact of the capable versus the capacity. Means you can go either way.
Yes.
And I lead that into our hero of the year of century, Edward Bernays, who most don't even know is the reason women can smoke and that we go to war. And so he's a hidden figure from history, and I would not call him a hero, but I don't know where he would fall, whether he and Mills would be able to have a debate together on what they see as the sheep out there and the easily manipulated of us.
It's a question. Bernays is considered the father, if you want to use that expression anymore, of modern propaganda, how you manipulate masses of people. And there is a question of how successful can propaganda be if it's cleverly, consistently applied in duping people. I don't have an answer to that. So those of you are interested, the most famous chapter of Hitler's Mein Kampf is the chapter 6 on propaganda. And he has these lessons, how to manipulate the masses, because he says the masses are impervious to reason. You can't reason. The only thing that they're moved by is emotions. And he has all of these pointers. Keep it simple.
Right.
Keep repeating it. Appeal to the emotions, not to the reason. And he has this whole little playbook how to manipulate. And you look at it and think, well, is it right?
So add to that someone like Smedley Butler, who you mentioned the name, and most people don't even know who I'm talking about. And he was heroic of the people. So then I also look historically at the Wallace-Truman year of 1944. So FDR was an anomaly because he took you through a depression, through war, and so people didn't really want to change midstream at that point. He could have gone 6 terms just because of that particular moment in history. People grew up not knowing anyone but FDR. So I'm not saying I'm pro-FDR or not, I'm pro-Eleanor, pretty much. But Wallace was, if FDR truly cared about his legacy, then he would have been more instrumental for getting Wallace the nomination that really should have been his and not Truman. So I think of today, who people think are heroes are Elon Musk. And I don't know whether business people should be excluded just by the sense of it or looking at it, because we seem to idolize them on that level of Trump being a success without looking at all the bankruptcies he caused.
I don't think, honestly, look, I'm sure there are going to be 10,000 books written on why Trump won.
Oh, I don't care.
But I don't think it was because he was a billionaire and people worship money. I think a lot of people thought, well, he knows something about money. Maybe he could pull us out of this. Yes. That's it. Yes. Which wasn't altogether a stupid reaction. No. I don't think it was so irrational. But that's just one person's opinion. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to disagree with Mills.
Okay.
The progress is initiated by genius, and the masses will follow along. I don't think so. I think the masses are easily led by demagogues, by people who push forth. Case in point, 3 of our heroes of today's age, Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, and Chelsea Clinton. Sorry, not Chelsea Clinton. Oh, for God's sake, how did I say? No.
Can you hear
Bradley Manning?
I want this on record. She said the 3 greatest heroes of our time are Julian Assange, Snowden and Chelsea Clinton.
I meant Chelsea Manning.
She's going to be very flattered, Chelsea. Go ahead.
Oh, Chelsea, I didn't tell you. No, it was, and Chelsea Manning. These are three of our heroes of today. And where are they? One's in exile, one's in prison, and, well, two are in prison. And, you know, so if the masses really believed, really did follow in genius, we would be, these people would be in charge. You know, I mean, look, these are brilliant people.
Well, with all due respect,
I didn't say, and I'm
with
sorry,
all
I
due
didn't
respect, you left out a fourth who has been unemployed for 10 years and is now teaching.
And of course, sitting at the end of our table here. But no,
Well, if you
I
include
just feel
Chelsea
that
Clinton, why not me?
we'll invite her for Wednesday's class.
No,
The
we
kid.
won't.
That down now.
She'll probably take all my
Oh my
brownies.
God. I hope this isn't showing in Madagascar. But really, though, the genius, unfortunately, so often is just denigrated. It's ignored. If you have a good PR man there, like our friend Chelsea Clinton, like her mother. Like her mother, you know, Hillary. By the way, Hillary is running again in 2020, in case anyone hasn't heard, and she has a new haircut. But yeah,
You heard it here first, Albert.
right.
Okay, wait.
But you know, she
Yeah.
has a good PR group working behind her. So you know, like people love Hillary. Why, I don't know. But the point is that genius. We imprison them or assassinate them. So I'm not sure that people really do follow along with what is innately
Look,
good.
it's a fair objection, and I'm not going. You can't answer these questions. It's an assessment.
And why
Yeah.
not? Isn't that what we're here for?
No, to contemplate them, not to answer them.
You're being
I mean,
difficult.
if you want to answer, you're going to have to provide way more brownies than you have thus far. Okay, I want to now just go
I'm
to
being
the
blackmailed.
last part of Mill's argument before we get to his limitations. As we know, Mill, for the 1000th time, is very sensitive to language. And now he's going to make an argument not just for individuality, but he's going to make an argument for over-the-top individuality. He's going to make an argument for eccentricity, or to use current language, he's going to make an argument for weirdos. He thinks weirdos are a sign, an index of the health of a society. The more eccentrics there are, the more weirdos there are, the healthier society is. And so he's going to put forth a series of propositions. So we're going to ask Albert to enter eccentricity. Okay. We're going to start with in this age. Who would like to read it? Somebody new? Carrington, thank you for volunteering.
Of course.
I didn't hear.
In this age, the mere example of nonconformity, the mere refusal to bend the knee to custom, is itself a service, precisely because the tyranny of opinion is such as to make eccentricity a reproach. It is desirable, in order to break through that tyranny, that people should be eccentric. Eccentricity has always abounded when and where strength of character has abounded, and the amount of eccentricity in a society has generally been proportional to the amount of genius, mental vigor, and moral courage which it contained. That so few now dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of the time.
Just as a historical footnote, my students in 1 year, maybe it was in your class, they made me a t-shirt of Mill, I should have brought it, that so few now to be dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of our time. It wasn't your class? Please leave. No. Okay. Mill is here making 3 claims. each of which is a powerful claim, you might say. Claim number one, he says, because our society is so stiflingly conformist, it's a good thing if people are eccentric just for the sake of being eccentric. Even if you don't really believe in your eccentricity, he says, to break the stifling conformity of the times in which we live, there is something to be gained from eccentricity in itself, even if it's not, so to speak, a heartfelt eccentricity, or it's not a eccentricity that's arising from your innards. Even if it's a kind of fake eccentricity, he says it's a good thing. I know you're perplexed by that, because so much of Mill has been talking about is authenticity, being true to yourself. So if somebody's just eccentric for the sake of eccentricity, how can it be of value? Now, as you've noticed in Mill, he has, so to speak, a parallel structure between his arguments on liberty of speech and liberty of conduct. Who is the person in liberty of speech that resembles the person who's eccentric for the sake of being eccentric? Anyone can figure that out? There is, in the section of Mill on liberty of speech, there is a person he describes who is similar to the person who's eccentric just for the sake of being eccentric. Who can figure out who is that person? I'm going to demand that somebody do this, because otherwise I will see myself as a failure as an instructor. Cecilia seems pained by the mere question. Anyone? Barbara, you have to vindicate the class and vindicate my skills as a pedagogue, or my pedagogical skills. Who is the person in liberty of speech that resembles the eccentric who's just eccentric for the sake of eccentricity? Anyone?
I'm trying to remember the parable.
Anyone?
It's a real person. I think it's a description.
Some people weren't here for those early classes, but there were some. Albert, you were here. No excuses.
No excuses.
Cam gave you the microphone.
So what exactly am I supposed to
Could you please cut that out? What exactly? You're supposed to answer the question. Philip?
I'm trying to remember if it was before I joined the class. I remember the paragraphs we talked about.
Okay.
Who is that person in the
The
liberty
test or
of
the test?
Beach.
the devil's advocate?
Yes!
Where was it? Barbara?
That's why Barbara,
She didn't do it
by
on mine.
making herself more valuable to herself, has made her more valuable to others. The devil's advocate.
Oh,
The devil's advocate doesn't necessarily believe what he or she is saying. They're the ones who just say it for the sake of disagreeing. Sometimes, not all devil's advocates, but they say it for the sake of disagreeing. And Mill says, even though they don't actually believe what they're saying, they are what we call nowadays contrarians. They just always disagree. He says the devil's advocate performs a useful function because he or she is constantly trying to find holes in your argument. And the equivalent of the devil's advocate, the person doesn't really believe in his or her own argument, but simply is contrary, constantly looking for errors and flaws in your argument. The eccentric who's eccentric just for the sake of being eccentric. So, there you are, on the subway, the Wall Street stop. Everybody has the same three-piece suit, the same briefcase, the same shoes, the same blow-dried hair, everyone. And then on comes on the subway some exhibitionist with spikes coming out of every orifice, seen and unseen, and wearing some weird outfit. And probably this person doesn't, is just a kind of exhibitionist, which is another form of a devil's advocate. But Mill says they still perform a useful function precisely because the tyranny of opinion is such as to make eccentricity a reproach. The tyranny of opinion is so oppressive that everybody's afraid to be different. It is desirable in order to break through that tyranny that people should be eccentric. Just to a breath of fresh air amidst all of this stifling, suffocating conformity. That's claim number one. Claim number two is a very big challenge. Mill says the more weirdos there are in a society, the healthier that society is. Let's be clear. He has now gone one step beyond individuality. We have to be sensitive to the words. He's now talking about super individuality, or individuality with a vengeance, eccentrics, weirdos. And he has a kind of, you might call it, a strange correlation. Wherever there are a lot of eccentrics, there you will find strength of character. And he says, wherever there are wherever there's a large amount of eccentricity, it's directly proportional to the amount of genius, mental vigor, and moral courage in that society. The more eccentrics. Now remember, we have to be clear about what he's saying. He's not making the easy argument, the more individuality there is, there'll be more genius, mental vigor, and moral courage. He's making the tougher argument. Remember, he's writing in more or less Victorian England, and he says 3 cheers for eccentrics, for weird people. And then the last claim is, the main problem with our society is there are not enough weirdos. There are not enough weirdos. That so few now dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of our time. So there are 3 propositions there. Who would like to comment on any of the 3?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
In that genius, mental vigor, and
Moral courage.
The last one I don't understand.
Moral courage?
Well, I don't understand. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I understand, I can envision how, like what he's saying about how
you can envision how eccentricity
relates
can correlate with genius.
Yeah, mental
vigor.
vigor.
You can figure how it correlates with mental vigor, but you can't...
Moral courage, no, I don't know what he's referring to by saying that. And I can't even project into, like, British society to
I don't think we need British society. He says, if you have the strength to be out there eccentric, weird, it shows a certain kind of moral courage. It's not everybody who's willing to flaunt his or her weirdness with all the attendant consequences of being ostracized, humiliated, degraded. It does take a lot of moral courage to do that sort of thing, because the first reaction of society is not to call an eccentric. What's the first reaction of society? But to call them what? Weird or sick. Weird or sick. One of the problems, I'm going to call on you in a half moment, there are many problems with Mill's formulation, and I hope we'll explore them in the next 15 minutes. We're going to get the announcement in a half second. But one of the big problems with Mill's formulation, which we already discussed in the previous class, is Mill makes no allowance for, he doesn't acknowledge that there is a line between eccentricity and pathology. Yes, it's true, many people who were once considered pathological, sick, they have now moved over. They're not only no longer in the eccentric category or individual character, they're just mainstream. So it is true that people who were once classified as pathological ill are now classified as at most eccentric, and a lot of times just individuals or even mainstream. The line has shifted a lot. On the other hand, it has to be acknowledged that some people are downright sick. And if they are downright sick, then they can't be contributing much to mental vigor and moral courage. They need help. And this is a big problem in Mill. How do you he doesn't really engage the question of how you distinguish when a person should be encouraged because it's eccentricity and where a person should be discouraged because it's pathology. How do you know that? Now, I will agree that historically it's shown itself to be a very malleable creature, this category called pathology. I'll agree with that. But I don't think anyone would seriously want to entertain that there is a category of people who our job is not to encourage them, our job is to help them. They need help, not encouragement. And where you draw that line, I'll admit it's very tough. But my problem with Mill is he doesn't even acknowledge there's a question.
He's kind of more talking about the effect on society than the individual who is that. It seems like to me, like he's more interested in how. You know what I mean?
Right, but you will acknowledge, let's take a simple example. And I don't mean to prejudice the argument. I'm trying to parse the argument. Is pedophilia an eccentricity or is it a pathology? Yeah. Should we encourage it? Should we encourage it because it's an eccentricity, or should we discourage it because it's a pathology?
Of course.
There is no, you see, the problem is there is no, of course. Because 30 years ago, there are questions where you ask that question, homosexuality, of course you discourage it, it's a pathology. The problem is there is no of course. On the other hand, there are categories of behavior which I think fall within the category of pathology. And I don't think Mill engages that question. Go ahead.
I don't even think you have to go into the realm of the pathological. Mm-hmm. I think you could say that some individualism is highly irritating, right, to the collective society. You know, I just think of many cases where people express their own sense of who they are. It could be that eccentric on the subway that is annoying a car full of people. So to me, I wouldn't even take it to the degree of pathological. I mean, to me,
Okay, that's a fair point. Can you tell me your name?
Sivia.
Sivia says we don't even have to look at the extreme cases to ask ourselves whether what Mill says is valid. She says we can even take cases where people are just expressing their individuality or claim to be expressing their individuality. And she says, I don't see how they add to genius, mental vigor, and moral courage. They're just an annoyance. That's all they are. They're just annoying. Philip seems to be signaling something with his eyes. I don't know.
Why are you picking up on
Because
that?
I'm watching
I'm
it.
having a communication.
I'm watching this.
Because I'm trying to keep my tongue in.
I'm watching this.
I mean, I could take this in so many more directions too.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like I would say, like coming from an insular society, the argument is always made that when someone expresses their individuality, it's a selfish choice that takes away from the collective, and it's actually true. If you have somebody, you know, who's leaving a large Orthodox family, you know, to go live their life of their choosing, then everybody else and their siblings will have trouble getting married. So I see this in the work I do. But so I would say, to me, this whole piece is highly prescriptive, that holds a lot of realities at bay. You know, you have to ignore power structures, you have to ignore hierarchy, you have to ignore the fact that for any kind of advancement, technological advancement, you need the masses, you know, to build the Brooklyn Bridge, you know, to build the cities, whatever it is. And so to me, it's like, okay, we have this newfangled thing called democracy, and we have some choices we can make around the way we want to show up. Let's say we do believe in something called a society in the first place, because I think you have to for this argument. So people should have just enough of their own inkling of what that means to participate in a way where we're going to end up a little bit ahead of where we would otherwise. To me, that's the extent of the argument that you could make here, because anything beyond that, you have to take the other factors into play.
Can I want to just,
stop there.
I want to restate what Sivia just said, which, by the way, comes up in our discussion of Dostoevsky also. She says that this pushes the individuality argument so much at the expense of not talking about the aspects of society where we have to learn to act collectively, to cooperate, to collaborate, to work together. And she says, well, you know, in the morning on the subway, we're packed into this car, and I really wish people weren't acting out their individuality and showing a little old-fashioned word. It's called consideration. We're all in this car together. And Mill only seems to be concerned about the space opened up for eccentricity, individuality, and so forth. And it reaches this kind of crescendo, as it does in Dostoevsky, where you completely forget, as Sivia said, we are in a society. There are collective endeavors, collaborative endeavors. We have to not only express our individuality, we also have to work together. And it wouldn't hurt, as I've tried to explain to my neighbor upstairs, who is thrilled at the prospect of her daughter doing gymnastics. And I try to explain that you don't swim in your bathtub, you swim in a swimming pool. You don't dribble a basketball in the bedroom, you dribble it on a basketball court. And you don't do gymnastics in the living room, you do it in a gym. And I try to convey to her there's this concept called individuality, excuse me, consideration. And she seems to think that her daughter's gymnastics display huge amounts of genius, mental vigor, and moral courage. And I am of the opinion that that is one spoiled brat who would like to smack the daylights out of. And I saw them both on the street today, and it took Herculean self-discipline for me not to run them down with my bicycle and take that off. But we have 3 minutes. Anyone want to make a strong statement? Because the other argument is, since the young woman, you'll remind me of your name? Tamara, she mentioned coming to New York. And New York is a magnet for weirdos, in a positive sense and in a negative sense. And then the argument can be, is it one thing that makes New York so... Yeah. Is it one thing that makes New York so filled with genius, mental vigor, and moral courage? Is it the fact that it has a high concentration of eccentrics? New York is a lively, vibrant place. Everybody says so. Everybody feels it. And is Mill right when he says it's because where eccentricity has abounded, that's where genius, mental vigor, and moral courage abound. And therefore, there is a validity to what he's saying. But like most truths, as Sylvia points out, there's an element of a half-truth here. That he gets so carried away, as does Dostoevsky, we'll see on Wednesday, that he completely loses sight of the fact that we function with others, and a lot of us care about others. It's not a matter of, our highest goal is not our eccentricity, or as Dostoevsky says, our volition, our will. Maybe our highest goal is a decent world. It's not just, I don't know. Next class.